In 2016, the US presidential election came down to a race between two candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Those two candidates had something in common. On the day of the election, they both had about a 55% disapproval rating. What? Have you thought about how absurd that is? Yeah. There are over 300 million people in the United States, most of whom do not have a history of scandals and corruption. We went through over a year of debates and primaries to weed out the bad candidates, to find the best of the best, the shining stars, the cream of the crop, the finest candidates we could come up with. And the best we could do were two schmucks who were each hated by over half of the voters. The bizarre thing is, that's not even uncommon. Congress rarely gets above a 40% approval rating. Since 2010, it's hovered between about 15 to 20%. That's insane. We selected those people. There are a handful that are respected among various factions. Most are not. There is something broken with our election system. Okay, actually, that's not quite true. When I say something, that implies one thing. There are actually a lot of broken things. Won't remember them all, but we have gerrymandering, we have our lax campaign finance system, we have the consolidation of media ownership, we have some very poorly run polling places, we have candidates were locked out during the last election, most notably Senator Sanders. We have the, I forget the name of the voting, of the debate commission. But let's put all those aside for a moment and focus on just one item, which is arguably the most basic and academic of them all, namely how the votes are counted in the first place. In the United States, we mostly use a system called first past the post. In this voting system, each voter votes for one candidate per office, and the winner is whichever candidate gets the most votes. A big problem with this system is something called Duverger's law, named after a French sociologist who noticed that first past the post systems tend to consolidate power into just two political parties. That doesn't always happen. Didn't happen in India, didn't happen in Canada, but it hit the US hard. We've had just two parties since the country was founded, starting from the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, going up to the Democrats and Whigs, and since the time of Lincoln, Democrats and Republicans. This is a problem, because if those two parties degrade to the point where they're sponsoring bad candidates, then the voters have a lose-lose choice between voting for the lesser of two evils or voting for some third-party candidate and essentially throwing away their votes so they don't even get to choose between those two evils. However, that's not the only voting system that exists. There are others. A lot of countries use a system called proportional voting. Proportional voting is used in 94 countries to elect their legislatures. It only really works for offices with multiple seats. With proportional voting, instead of voting for an individual, you instead vote for a party, and often for the candidates within that party. Then, after the votes are tallied, the seats are allocated according to the percent of the population that voted for each party. For example, say that 12% of the population voted for the Green Party. In that case, 12% of the seats, roughly, would be allocated to the members of the Green Party. That way, if there are, let's say, 20 seats, you can vote for a party that only represents 5% of the population and not be throwing away your vote. It's a nice system, and it works fairly well in the countries that have used it, but it doesn't work well for an office with just one seat, such as a president or governor. There are other voting systems that do work well for one seat. One that I'm not particularly fond of, but it has a lot of support, is called range voting. This is the system they use in the Olympics. instead of voting for just one candidate, you cast a vote for each candidate, giving each of them a score, let's say from 0 to 10. You might say, oh, I like this candidate, I'll give him a 9. Indifferent about this one, I'll give him a 5. I hate this guy, I'll give him a 0. Then on election day, the winner is the candidate who has the highest cumulative vote, cumulative score added up amongst all voters. It works. One thing I don't like about it is that it tends to give a little bit more power to extremist voters who just give 10s and 0s to everyone instead of giving more nuanced votes. That said, the simplest form of range voting doesn't have that problem. Approval voting, in which there are only 2 scores you can give each candidate. Approve or disapprove, or let's call it thumbs up and thumbs down. And the winner is the one with the most thumbs up. Arguably, some of our elections do work that way. Like, for example, if you've ever noticed your ballot where it says you may vote for up to 3. That said, while range voting does have its adherents, I prefer ranked voting. This is going to be a little bit difficult to describe, so I brought a visual aid. With ranked voting, instead of giving each candidate a score, you rank them from your most favorite to your least favorite. In this example, 40% of the population prefers candidate B over candidate A over D over C, and so on. This gives you a lot more input into your preferred candidates. With first past the post systems, all you would see would be the top candidate, and in that system, you would say, oh, candidate B, he has 40% of the vote. Even though 60% of the people think that B would be the worst choice for the job. However, with that additional power comes a problem. How do you combine all those rankings to come up with the best candidate? One of the simplest is called instant runoff. With instant runoff, you look at the top candidate in each column. If one has a majority vote, great, he wins. If not, you remove the one with the fewest votes, look at the top remaining ones, and keep removing the one with the fewest votes until somebody has a majority. In this case, candidate C with 60% of the votes. C certainly looks better than B on the face of it, since 60% of the people prefer C to B. But if we're going to think about who would win if they race one-on-one, there's another system called Condorcet voting, where you look at who would beat all of the other candidates. Take a look at candidate A. If candidate A ran against B, he'd win with 60% of the vote. If he ran against C, he'd win with 65% of the vote. And if he ran against D, he'd also win with 65% of the vote. Many people, myself included, think that this is probably the way to select the one who best represents the will of the people. There are multiple ways of figuring out a Condorcet winner. And by the way, one doesn't always exist. You can wind up with a rock, paper, scissors situation where A would beat B, B would beat C, and C would beat A. The 2 most popular are Schultz Foundation and ranked peers, which I like because it's somewhat simpler to explain. Obviously, I'm just scratching the surface here. There are a lot of variations to each of those systems that I'm not covering, and you can combine them in various ways. No voting system is perfect. There's even a mathematical theorem called Arrow's paradox that proves that you can't have a perfect voting system. But I'm quite certain you can do better than first past the post. In my opinion, if we adopted something like proportional voting or one of the Condorcet methods, we could get a much better selection than we're currently getting. Thank you.